That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
Imagine watching a television show, loving every episode, building memories around it, and then one day discovering that one of its most powerful stories was quietly removed from existence before you ever had the chance to see it. Not pulled because of a technical error. Not lost in a fire or flood. Deliberately taken away. Locked in a vault. Scrubbed from syndication packages, skipped on home video releases, and left completely out of the cultural conversation for over 5 decades. Now imagine that episode finally surfacing again after 55 years, and realizing that the reason it was hidden from you was not because it was bad television. It was because it was too honest. That is exactly what happened with one episode of The Twilight Zone, a show that already pushed boundaries in every direction imaginable. And the story of why it was banned, and why it has finally come back, tells us something deeply important not just about television history but about who we are as a society, what we are willing to face, and what we would rather keep locked in the dark. The Twilight Zone first appeared on American television in October of 1959, and from its very first episode it was unlike anything audiences had seen before. There was no recurring cast of characters. There was no ongoing plot that viewers had to follow week to week. Instead, each episode was its own self-contained universe, a new story with new people, a new dilemma, and almost always a twist that forced the audience to reconsider everything they had just watched. What connected every episode was not character or narrative but tone and purpose. The show existed to make people think, to use the safe disguise of science fiction and fantasy to smuggle genuinely difficult ideas into living rooms across America at a time when the country was deeply uncomfortable with direct confrontation of its own problems. The man behind this vision was Rod Serling, and understanding who he was is essential to understanding why this particular banned episode matters so much. Serling was not simply a talented television writer. He was a veteran of World War II who had served in the Pacific and witnessed combat up close. He returned from the war carrying real psychological weight, and that weight shaped everything he wrote afterward. He had seen what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the name of nation, ideology, and fear. And when he came home and entered the world of American television, he found himself frustrated at every turn by a broadcast system that rewarded comfortable stories and punished uncomfortable truths. Before The Twilight Zone, Serling had tried to tell difficult stories through conventional drama. He wrote a live television play that was intended to reflect the brutal murder of Emmett Till, a black teenager killed in Mississippi in 1955 in an act of racially motivated violence that shocked the conscience of the nation. Network executives and sponsors panicked. They forced rewrites. They changed the victim's identity. They removed every specific detail that made the story what it was, until the final broadcast had been hollowed out so completely that its original purpose had been destroyed. Serling watched his work get dismantled in real time, and he came away from that experience with a clear understanding of how the system worked. Direct confrontation was impossible. If you wanted to say something true about American society, you had to say it sideways. The Twilight Zone was his solution. By setting stories on other planets, in distant futures, in mysterious towns with no names, or in abstract dimensions that existed outside of ordinary logic, Serling could address racism, paranoia, authoritarianism, nuclear dread, social conformity, and the darkest corners of the human psyche without triggering the same alarm bells that would have stopped a straightforward dramatic treatment. Sponsors and network censors were far less likely to object to a parable about mob mentality if it was framed as a story about a small town terrorized by an alien signal. They were less bothered by commentary on blind patriotism if the setting was a spaceship from the future rather than a city hall in the present. Serling used genre as camouflage, and for much of the show's 5-season run, it worked brilliantly. But there were limits, and in the 5th and final season of the series, one episode pushed past those limits in a way that the network decided it simply could not tolerate. The episode was called The Encounter, and it aired for the first and only time on May 1, 1964. After that single broadcast, it disappeared. It was excluded from the syndication packages that would carry The Twilight Zone into the following decades on local stations and cable channels. It was left off home video collections. It was not part of the marathons or the DVD box sets or the early streaming releases. For a long time, many fans of the show did not even know it existed. Those who did know about it could only find degraded copies circulating through informal channels, passed hand to hand like contraband. The episode became a legend, something whispered about in fan communities, something people claimed to have seen but could never quite prove. What was it about the encounter that made it so radioactive? The answer is layered and genuinely complicated, which is in many ways the entire point. The episode is a two-character drama set entirely within a single attic. There is no alien invasion, no time travel, no supernatural creature waiting around a corner. Just two men, a confined space, and a conversation that slowly becomes something far more dangerous than either of them anticipated. One character is a white World War II veteran named Fenton. The other is a young Japanese-American man named Arthur who has come looking for odd jobs. Fenton finds an old Japanese sword in his attic, a relic he brought home from the war, and he invites Arthur up to take a look. What begins as a casual, almost friendly interaction gradually unravels into something much darker as the two men circle around the unspoken history between them, a history defined by war, suspicion, violence, and the guilt that neither can simply set down. The performances in the episode are genuinely extraordinary. Neville Brand plays Fenton with a coiled, unstable energy that makes every moment feel like it is one wrong word away from disaster. And Arthur was played by a young actor named George Takei, who would become famous just 2 years later as Hikaru Sulu in Star Trek, but who at the time of filming the encounter was still early in his career. What many viewers at the time did not know, and what makes the episode even more powerful in retrospect, is that George Takei had personally lived through the historical injustice that the episode was built around. As a child during World War II, Takei and his family were among the more than 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to internment camps by the United States government in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was 5 years old when soldiers came to his family's door. He has spoken about what it was like to see his parents helpless, to watch everything they had built be taken away, to grow up knowing that his country had decided he was a threat based on nothing more than his ancestry. This historical context is crucial to understanding the encounter because the episode does not pretend that the internment did not happen. It exists inside that history. Arthur's character carries the specific wound of being a Japanese-American man in a country that imprisoned people who looked like him without charge or trial. But the episode does something that made its original audience deeply uncomfortable, and that made network executives extremely nervous. It introduces ambiguity into that history. In the course of the conversation, Arthur reveals something about his father that complicates the clean narrative of innocent victims and unjust oppressors. The revelation is not presented as simple truth. It is tangled up in psychological pressure, in the strange intensity of the attic's atmosphere, in what the script suggests might be the influence of the sword itself. Whether what Arthur says is literally true, or whether it represents something else entirely, something about inherited shame, about the impossible position of belonging to a group that your country decided to treat as the enemy, is left deliberately open. This ambiguity was exactly what CBS could not handle. When the episode aired and viewer complaints began arriving, the network chose the path of least resistance. Rather than defend the episode as the morally complex piece of writing it was, rather than engage with the difficult questions it was asking, they simply made it go away. The complaints came from multiple directions. Some viewers felt the episode was unfair to Japanese Americans, that the suggestion of a father's treachery reinforced the same racist suspicions that had justified the internment in the first place. Others felt the episode was too harsh in its portrayal of the white veteran. Some simply found the whole thing too intense, too unresolved, too unwilling to hand them a comfortable ending. The sponsors who paid for the show's advertising wanted nothing to do with controversy. And CBS, which was already watching the show's ratings decline in its 5th season and was not planning to renew it, decided that the simplest solution was to erase the encounter from the record. For 55 years, that erasure held. The episode became one of the most discussed missing artifacts in American television history, known primarily through reputation rather than actual viewing. The irony of a show built on the idea of stories that must be told becoming the home of a story that the network decided could never be told again was not lost on anyone who followed the history closely. And then, in 2016, something changed. The Sci-Fi Channel included the encounter in a New Year's Eve marathon of the series, airing it publicly for the first time since its original broadcast in 1964. The response was significant. Viewers who had never heard of the episode were confronted with something that felt startlingly contemporary. Fans who had spent years trying to track down copies were finally seeing the original in proper quality. And critics who had known about the episode's reputation found that the reality lived up to it entirely. The return of the encounter to wider circulation is not just a piece of broadcasting trivia. It raises genuinely important questions about how societies manage their cultural memory, about what happens when art that makes us uncomfortable is simply removed from view rather than engaged with on its own terms. When the encounter was pulled from syndication in the 1960s, it was not replaced by a better, more sensitive treatment of the same themes. There was no more nuanced exploration of the internment, no more honest reckoning with wartime guilt, no television drama that stepped into the space left by the episode's disappearance and did the work that the encounter was trying to do. The story was simply gone, and the questions it was asking went unanswered on screen for a very long time. This pattern was not unique to the encounter. The Twilight Zone had several other episodes that encountered significant difficulties in their afterlives, each for different reasons. Miniature, which featured a then-unknown Robert Duvall in a quietly haunting story about a man who becomes convinced that the inhabitants of a museum dollhouse are real people living real lives, was pulled from syndication because of a copyright dispute between CBS and the estate of the author whose original story had inspired the episode. The network had not secured the proper long-term licensing rights, and rather than negotiate, they simply removed the episode from circulation for decades. It eventually returned when the legal issues were resolved, but its prolonged absence meant that many Twilight Zone viewers grew up without ever encountering what is widely considered one of the series' most affecting and beautifully performed stories. Another episode, known as A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, told the story of an older man pressured by his younger wife into taking an experimental drug that is supposed to reverse the aging process. The serum works, but it works catastrophically well, reducing him to childhood and leaving his wife in an entirely unexpected and unwanted role. The episode was held out of syndication for years due to legal threats involving claims that the story bore an uncomfortable resemblance to an earlier unproduced script. The details of the dispute were never fully made public, but the practical effect was the same as it had been with Miniature. The episode simply ceased to exist for most viewers. Sounds and Silences was another episode that ran into trouble, this time because of a lawsuit filed by a private individual who claimed that the story was based on his life without his knowledge or consent. The episode followed a man with an obsessive relationship to loud noise who eventually finds himself tormented by sounds that only he can hear at unbearable volume. The psychological portrait was specific enough that someone recognized themselves in it, or believed they did, and CBS responded by pulling the episode rather than fighting the claim in court. It is a reminder that the line between inspired storytelling and legal liability was always thin in early television, and that networks typically chose the safest option when that line was tested. Perhaps the most unusual case among the missing episodes is an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which stands apart from everything else in the Twilight Zone catalog because it was not originally made for the series at all. It was a French short film, directed by Robert Enrico and based on a famous short story by the American writer Ambrose Bierce, about a Confederate sympathizer who is about to be hanged and appears to escape in the moments before death, before the viewer realizes that the entire escape was a hallucination occurring in the seconds before the noose snaps tight. CBS purchased the rights to broadcast the film as a single episode of The Twilight Zone in 1964, which was itself a bold and unusual decision. But the rights acquired were only for a single broadcast, and once that broadcast happened, the episode could not be aired again without a new agreement. The licensing situation was never resolved, and the episode existed in a peculiar limbo, acknowledged in historical accounts of the series but unavailable to most viewers for many years.